I wanna answer a few questions from last time, and then just go right into where we left off. I was asked, when were areas A, B, and C as the designated different areas of jurisdiction, variously, as I'll explain in a moment, implemented? They were implemented as part of the second part of the Oslo framework. So Oslo was divided into two phases. There was Oslo I, Roman numeral I, and Oslo II, Roman numeral II. Oslo II began in September of '95. That was exactly when I was in Israel, which divided the West Bank into three areas, which still are the ways in which the West Bank is divided up today. Area A, controlled by Palestinians, which, by the way, is by landmass the largest part of the West Bank. So the largest part of the West Bank is fully under Palestinian jurisdiction, but there's a big asterisk after that. Area B, which is jointly controlled by an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, or Israeli-Palestinian shared authority, with Israeli military jurisdiction and Palestinian civil authority. So all of like the mechanisms of infrastructure, taxation, business, civic life, all under Palestinian jurisdiction, but under Israeli military control. And then there's Area C, and Hebron is both the best example of this, but by best I also mean most egregious in terms of the problems and challenges, which is controlled by the Israelis, both civil and military. The problem is, even though it is true that the largest share of the West Bank is Area A, if you look at an actual map, it's a kind of Swiss cheese. And therefore, even if a majority of the territory by landmass and also population does have Palestinian civil and security authority, it's not contiguous. And so that's why we read often about the challenges of checkpoints, both not only between the Palestinian territories and sovereign Israel, where Palestinians who want to work in Israel from the West Bank, and by the way, many, many, many tens of thousands of Palestinians every day get up to go to work in Israel. Why? Because the jobs pay better and offer better labor protections, and often there are just more opportunities to work in Israel. But in order to do that, you have to cross at a checkpoint or a border crossing because it's a different state. So you have to go from the West Bank to Israel. There was even a lot of that happening between Gaza and Israel before October 7th, but that is not happening today. So that's another smaller, less mentioned part of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza, is there's also a labor conflict, a labor crisis. But even within the West Bank itself, Palestinians do not have long-range freedom of movement. You can't just go and visit your brother in another town, because the likelihood is you're going from Area A to Area C to Area B, back to Area A, all of which requires long, at times extensive, at times humiliating, at times very agonizing border crossings. I have witnessed border crossings up close and personal a number of times. It's not something you want to do. It is also not rife with abuse. Israel has its own NGOs that are monitoring the border crossings to make sure there are not overt abuses of Israeli security power against Palestinians who just want to get into Israel to work for the day and then come back home. But on a good day, you're standing in line holding a clear plastic baggie with your lunch in it and nothing else, so that you can quickly move through the security procedure for at least 45 minutes and often much, much longer, like just standing. And it's a long snaking line where and this might be starting at 4 or 4:30 in the morning every day, just to get to work. Now, again, Israel will argue, particularly in the wake of the Second Intifada, that such strictures, such control down to inspecting every human being who goes across through that checkpoint. A checkpoint's not just like a line with a gate. It's actually a large enclosed apparatus. It's like going into a big room with metal catwalk above, and there are people looking down on you, and they are heavily armed, right, in case something spicy happens at one of the border crossings. This is every single day in Israel for the last 23 years. Right, ever since the security barrier was put up, the security fence, security wall, depending on where you are in the country, along the Green Line, there are many different checkpoints or border crossings where Palestinians who want to work in Israel, and I've given you reasons why they might, must pass through this extremely difficult security process. And again, Israel will say, well, that's the price of keeping our people safe. And, this is everything we're talking about in this course. My intention is that by exploring Israel the last 30 years, we are not only talking about history, we're really talking about our story. Really can't understand today if you do not understand this 30-year period, beginning with Rabbi. And so even though history is thought of as linear, Jews are accustomed to looking at history as cyclical as well. And you're going to hear a lot of themes today that are evocative of the present condition here in 2025, even though I'm talking about history that is, 20 years old. Helene. I do not know, but you can look it up. I mean, there are approximately 2.2, 2.4 million Palestinians living in the West Bank. And another, 2 million living in Gaza, though after the war, that's very hard to get accurate statistics. Many have been displaced, not so much from Gaza, but from their homes, and of course, tens of thousands have been killed, at least, since October 7th. So I don't have an accurate division by population of A, B, and C, but I imagine that that's a simple Google search, and you'd want to verify your sources. Linda. The East Jerusalem is a whole different shebang. Just briefly, so A, B, and C are designations only for the West Bank. East Jerusalem, which is part of the city of Jerusalem, actually has a completely different designation. In some ways, East Jerusalem is the most complicated because residents of East Jerusalem who are predominantly Palestinian by ancestry, ethnicity, culture, language, family, etc., unlike their counterparts in any other city in Israel, so let's say Haifa, or we talked about Ramla, or any other village or city that is within, on the Israeli side of the Green Line, those Palestinians living in East Jerusalem are not citizens of Palestine, nor are they citizens of Israel. They don't have a passport. They have documents that say, I am East Jerusalem. That's their identity. So they have a very complicated scenario. Many of them work in the Jewish part or the west part of Jerusalem. So you have, a significant, I don't know population numbers as of today, but all of this you can just go online. So many Palestinians living in East Jerusalem work in Israel proper, but don't have their only documentation is that they are a resident of East Jerusalem. And in East Jerusalem is very complicated because, as we discussed last week, the status of Jerusalem has always been and remains to this day one of the 4 or 5 major sticking points that has hindered resolving the conflict, right? If you look at the conflict just as a political issue to be resolved, the outstanding issues that have never been successfully resolved are the borders in the territory itself. So what is Palestine and what in a future two-state model? By the way, I've never been less confident that that's something that's going to happen anytime soon, but that's the only framework that has been used since before 1948 as a model of partition. Right, starting with the UN partition plan in 1947, 1940. These are the important, this is the model. Thus far, we don't have a viable binational model, by which I mean one nation, two peoples, and I think that has its own huge problems. But we also don't have a viable two-state solution on account of irresolvable differences on borders, settlements, what happens to the settlements, both those deep within the West Bank and those on the periphery of Israeli population centers, most chiefly Jerusalem, which kind of goes in and out of the Green Line. Like, just look at it, just go on Google and ask for map of Green Line near Jerusalem. And again, it's like, woo, it's like an Etch-a-Sketch run by a 3-year-old. You just can't figure out where the border goes because some of it is Jewish suburbs and some of it is Arab suburbs. And in fact, one of the most fascinating things that I like to do, and we are going to be, please God, offering an intergenerational, all-congregation-wide trip to Israel, December break, winter break of next year, so 13 months from now. We're going to be going to Israel as a congregation. You'll be hearing more about that over the winter of this winter. We're about to announce it. We're also busy finalizing our Poland itinerary. I might have a moment to say a word about that because a number of you may wish to attend. When we go back to Israel, one of the activities I hope we'll get to do is you get on a Jerusalem train, like they have a light rail, which was built in the last 15, 20 years or so. It was built after I was there. And you get out in a suburb, and what you do is you just take the train from the exurbs down to the heart of Jerusalem. And you stop every 3 or 4 stops, and you're in a completely different kind of neighborhood. It's Haredi, it's secular, it's Arab, it's more militant, it's less militant, and then everybody's riding the bus together. I mean, this is the thing that doesn't get broadcast on social media. You can be riding a bus all morning just to get to work and go through 6 different Arab and 6 different Jewish neighborhoods on the Jerusalem light rail, with everybody just sitting next to each other on the train, just doing their morning routine like we do if you're taking MTA into Grand Central. I mean, really, that's every single day, all day long in Jerusalem. Yeah.
It does sound absolutely awful, ABCD. And there's definitely movies that show a poor student like trying to get from A to B to visiting his family. But it's terrible. But on the other hand, it has really cut down on terrorism.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you said that, but
Yeah, no. I mean, Israel will argue that it's in the security interests of Israel. I'll just add an affirming sentence, because it works. Yeah, because it works. Now, again, the counter-argument goes, yes, but if you subject one population to a certain kind of treatment, day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, for 25 years, you may not be surprised if they become restless and unhappy with that condition. Now, I'm a person who believes that there is never a justification for terrorism. There are all sorts of unequally treated populations all over the world, and not all of them perpetrate October 7th. Like, there's an unholy alliance between continually, right, where that has been their modus operandi, their MO. Right, yeah. I mean, to me, it's self-evident that just because you are, quote unquote, a minority, an oppressed population, suffering under the oppressions, whether it is of military occupation or late-stage capitalism, as we have here in the United States, we have millions of African Americans who are incarcerated due to unequal treatment under the law, would be my brief surmise. That does not mean that we accept the legitimacy of slaughtering people, like as a means of rectification for these unfortunate social conditions. I believe that political problems require political solutions, and sometimes political solutions require war, and sometimes war is not enough to solve problems, right? Okay, Michael, was that a hand? Yeah.
Yes. You described how there are thousands of Palestinians that want to, desire to cross into Israel each day for work and for other reasons. I know we're not there yet, but if there were a two-state solution, what does each side think in terms of how that model may stay the same or change?
I don't think we've gotten there yet. I mean, from what I understand is that every peace negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians got hung up on something bigger, like some primary issue. If you can't tell what your borders are, the other 3, by the way, I said borders and settlements. The other 2 are the status of Jerusalem Do we share? Do we split? Is it a capital for one people? Is it the eternal undivided capital of the Jewish people? And if it is, what do we do about the, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in East Jerusalem? And the fourth is the law of return, or the right of the so-called Palestinian right of return, which, again, no Israeli administration, right, left, or center, will or ever has accepted the notion of a Palestinian right of return. We can get more into that, but it's just a fact on the ground. So I don't know. I mean, I guess is the short answer is what would happen if there were a Palestine in, let's say we go back to the Ehud Barak proposal that was proposed in 2000 and then the Clinton parameters in 2001. Here's 96% of the West Bank. Form your own state. I mean, they're with land swaps. In other words, we will evacuate the deepest settlements in the middle of the territory, the hilltop youth, the ones that are kind of overrun by Fabrenta, overly zealous religious, national religious Jews. And we will keep some selected areas in the mostly Jerusalem suburbs as Israeli territory, places like Efrat, which is effectively a very near Jerusalem suburb. That will become Israel. There will be security guarantees along the border, jointly administered. The Palestinian nation will have to be in some way, or some meaningful way at least, for some perimeter of it demilitarized, like all of that gets talked about. But how would Palestinians actually get into Israel or Israelis into Palestine? I have no idea. Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always believed that economic cooperation is the most important piece of this. Right. Hard to know. And what will Israel's economic investment be in the West Bank? And who else will have an investment? Like, will it be the Gulf states trying to build little Abu Dhabis all over the place? I have no idea, right? But yeah, it'll be interesting. Okay. The currency in the West Bank, I want to say, is it the rial? It's the shekel. They still use Israeli currency. Thanks, Norm. I haven't transacted money in the West Bank. Every time I've gone, I've been like with a rabbi group, and they pay for lunch. Okay, so I haven't had to get money in the West Bank. Okay, so where I want to pick up, and I want to just read one other useful, I think my friend who wasn't able to make today's class, but who comes all the time, wanted to raise a disagreement. I actually think it's less of an either or and more of a both and. More than one thing can be true here. Our writer writes, one of the reasons you gave last week for Mizrahi's support, that is to say, Jews of Middle Eastern descent, for Likud and for Bibi, the right wing, the core right-wing party in Israel for the last, 50, 60 years, was that these Jews were coming from countries with strong men as rulers and had no history of democracy, and therefore are more inclined to support such leaders in Israel. Okay, I stand by that, by the way. Ashkenazi Jews coming from countries with more democracy tend to vote for labor. While I think that may be true for the Ashkenazi Soviet Jews, I totally disagree with that. It is not true. The Soviet Jews keep to themselves, vote their own way, tend to have their own parties, by the way, that want to represent the interests of Jews from the former Soviet Union. They are slowly assimilating into the fabric of Israeli society, but Russian Jews from the former Soviet Union, do tend to keep to themselves in Israeli society. And they've had all sorts of integration challenges as well, not just self-imposed ones. I mean, imagine you're a brilliant professor of, astrophysics in Moscow, and then you have to emigrate to Israel when the opportunity comes, because hard to be a Jew in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. You come over here and the only work you can get is driving a cab or taking out the trash. You might also be resentful. I think that makes sense. But he adds, I don't think this is the reason for the Mizrahi Jewish support for Bibi. Back in the 60s, when I lived in Israel, he adds, several of my cousins were and still are several years older than I am. They described their life in the military after high school as horrible. Sephardim, as we called ourselves back then, not Mizrahi. It was kind of just Ashkenazi Sephardi. Sephardi, though, really could refer to a Jew from Yemen who had nothing to do with the Iberian Peninsula. Sfarad is the Hebrew word for Spain. So Sephardi these days is not an accurate way of talking about Jews who come from Iraq, Iran, Tunisia, Libya, all those places. They described life in the military after high school as horrible. Sephardim, as we were called back then, were given the shit jobs. Israel's Ashkenazi founders, or their descendants, I would add, treated the Sephardim as second-class citizens, all true, assuming that most of them were simpletons and not capable of being pilots or elite ground troops or intelligence, I would add, all of that. The same held true in society in general, because in Israel, the social order is so very much dictated by where you are in the army. Like that, unlike college. Like here it's, Mike Simberkoff, even how many years after graduating college are you're sporting a New York University sweatshirt today? Is that your alma mater? Where you did not go, right? Okay, but in the States, like at least especially in places like Scarsdale, one mechanism of social placement, social advancement is through where you went to school. In Israel, it's what you did in the army. Oddly, the Israeli dislike of the Soviet emigres may have elevated the life of the Mizrahim, the new immigrant taking the rung below on the ladder. Well, that's probably true too. So I'm not sure I disagree with our writer here, but I thought it was worth bringing up because, like most large-scale social phenomena, it is multifactorial, right? Lots of reasons go into why a thing is the way it is. Okay, so where we left off last week, we begin in 2005 with the Gaza disengagement. My intention today is to get us to 2015, and that will set us up for next week. And then I'll say an extra word or two. So Arafat died in 2004. He was succeeded by his hand-picked successor, Mahmoud Abbas. Like most Arab people, the culture, the custom is you are named Abu and the name of your firstborn son. Abu is like Abba, Av. So he is called Abu Mazen, which just means he's the dad of Mazen, who was his firstborn son. Kind of the opposite custom in Jewish tradition where I'm Moshe ben David, right? I am the firstborn son. I'm the son of Douglas, David in Hebrew. So they are Abu Mazen or Abu. It's like an affectionate nickname in Arab culture to name yourself, to give yourself kind of like a name of honor once you become a dad, especially. And for women, it's is it's the same as Em or Ima, right? So Abba Ima, and Abu. Abu Mazen became the successor to Arafat. He was born in Tzfat, so you've probably been to Tzfat if you've been to Israel because it's a popular tourist destination up north in the Galilee region, the seat of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Followers of Isaac Luria in the 16th century really developed an entire new spiritual framework for Jewish life, Jewish prayer, Jewish study. Well, it was a Jewish Arab city. It was one of the number of cities in pre-state British mandatory Palestine that had a population of both Arabs and Jews living together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes neutrally, sometimes not so harmoniously. During the 1948 war, he fled, first to Cairo and then to the Soviet Union, and wrote a doctoral dissertation in Moscow, called The Other Side, the secret relationship between Nazism and Zionism, in which he argued that the number of Holocaust Jewish dead was exaggerated. The notion that 6 million Jews had been killed was a fantastic lie. So the current leader of the Palestinian Authority is a notorious Holocaust denier, has not retracted any of this. He also has not called for elections in nearly 18 years of governance, feckless and corrupt governance in the West Bank. He knows that if he were to call for elections, he would no longer be the head of the Palestinian Authority. And possibly there would be a violent overthrow in the West Bank the way there was, or that we shall hear in a moment, in Gaza just a couple years after disengagement. So seeing no path to bilateral peace, recognizing that 124 Israelis had been killed in Gaza just in the previous 5 years in skirmishes between 2000 and 2005, under Sharon, who again was the hawkiest of the hawks, he was really associated to his shame with the massacres, kind of looking the other way during the massacres of Palestinian refugees in two different camps, Sabra and Shatila, in the 1982 Lebanon War, in which the opposition Christian phalangists kind of went into these camps and just committed wholesale murder, wholesale massacres. And Sharon basically said, yeah, we're going to look the other way while that happens. Well, this ends up in Sharon having to resign in shame from his position as head of the IDF. Nevertheless, in Israel, Israel gives the lie to something that F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote. He said, Fitzgerald wrote, "There are no second acts in American life. But in Israeli life, every public figure gets a second act." We learned a few weeks ago. What's that? Maybe a third. Yeah, look at Bibi. He's had 9 lives. Cat-like. Trump gives the lie, right? That guy just won't go away. He keeps, okay. Kushner. Who knew? I mean, okay. Didn't think we'd be hearing from him again, but here he is. Okay. And by the way, did some good for the Jewish people this year, for sure. Israel withdrew unilaterally under Sharon's direction from Gaza, where close to 9,000 Jews had lived in settlements going back at least 34 years. This idea was first proposed in 2003 when Sharon said to a closed meeting of his cabinet officials, "I have decided to initiate a process of gradual disengagement with the hope of reducing friction between Israelis and Palestinians." Again, surprising that it was the quintessential, topmost Israeli hawk who proposed this, but that also gave him credibility. It wasn't that he could be impugned as some, bleeding heart, lefty Israeli hippie type. He was tougher than tough. The withdrawal was actually a source of tremendous social anxiety in Israel and internal friction. I mean, Israel really tore itself apart over this, with the national religious and the Haredi largely in line with opposition to the disengagement. Again, we've seen this before, but many Israelis presented the disengagement as a betrayal on the level of the capos, who were the Jewish inmates who, against their will, were used by the Nazi security officials, the Nazi guards in the camps during the Shoah, to oversee and torture, further torment, and run the lives of the other Jewish inmates. So to call a Jew a capo, to portray a Jew in Nazi regalia, is, of course, a very grave condemnation. It's very upsetting. I think that term is thrown around so haphazardly. It makes me very, very upset when I see my rabbinic friends called a capo because they did or did not sign some letter. I mean, self-hating Jew is light compared to capo. But Sharon and his administration were accused of outright Jew-on-Jew betrayal at that time. They also had a plan in place. They trained almost 15,000, I think 14,000 Israeli police officers were trained to handle the disengagement on the assumption that it was probably going to become violent. As it turns out, the disengagement, which took place in August and September of 2005, so just a little more than 20 years ago, was bloodless, again, but incredibly psychologically traumatic for the Israeli people. Sharon had run for office promising not to do this. That's important too. He had assured the ultra-religious people were not going to touch Gaza. But again, as more and more people were dying in Gaza, including Israelis in just skirmishes and terrorism and bloodshed, and Sharon just said, we have to find a way out of this. This is a bad thing for the Jews. And so he actually was the one to propose disengagement. Nobody resisted with significant violence, but I'm sure you can go on YouTube and look up Gaza disengagement 2005, and you'll be able to see the way it was covered on the news and the footage of Jews being dragged from their homes at the time by the thousands to leave Gaza. Since 2005, very important for the current conflict, although it has been missed over and over and over again, there are no settler Jews living in Gaza. So it is one of the reasons why I am vexed by the application of the term occupation to Gaza. The accurate term is there has been since 2005 a blockade of Gaza, jointly administered with Israel's peaceful security partner. We've had a treaty since 1977, Egypt. So Egypt controls the border, though before October 7th, was well known that Egypt was allowing in a whole bunch of smuggling of both things that you would want to have and things you would not want Gazans to have. But it was well known that you could get a Domino's pizza in Gaza City if you had the right connections, because you just smuggle it over from Egypt. It's kind of wild. Remember, Gaza is about the size of Metro Philadelphia, all of Gaza, the whole Gaza Strip. It's not, or Detroit. It's like the size of a large metropolitan area in the States. Detroit and Philly are usually the ones, because I think by square mileage, it's approximately the same. They're not counting the 1,000 kilometers of tunnels underneath. It's actually more than that. Sharon actually hoped, after the Gaza disengagement, to tackle the next big headache, which was the West Bank. So he wanted to disentangle Israel from the West Bank as well, and he even broke away from Likud in order to form a new political party to do so, called it Kadima, which means go forward. And just 4 months after the Gaza disengagement, as I mentioned last time, Sharon was felled by a massive stroke and persisted in an Israeli hospital in a vegetative state for more than 8 years, because Israel is extremely strict about not allowing anyone to die. It is another entanglement between the law and the Rabbanut, the Orthodox rabbinate, which has the most stringent read on issues pertaining to dying with dignity, dying with compassion, whatever your euphemism of choice is. That doesn't exist in Israel, because the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate says, no, you die when you die. You die when God says so, not when you want to. And so Sharon remained on a ventilator for 8 years. His successor was a former Jerusalem mayor named Ehud Olmert. He proposed handing over a majority of territory in the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority without even tackling all the other thorny issues. So Olmert's big idea was, let's just front load a plan for total disengagement from the West Bank, give it to the Palestinian Authority, and then we'll talk borders, settlements, right of return, and Jerusalem, the 4 biggies. The same day that Olmert announced this intention publicly, the PA held its own elections, and Hamas won the popular vote by a thin margin, in Gaza this is. But due to the weird Palestinian electoral system and a massive disunity within Fatah, which is the rival party, the secular party of which Abbas is the head, Hamas ended up capturing a majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. It's really weird. Like, I am hardly an expert in the ins and outs of the Palestinian political system, but what it ended up doing effectively was producing a split in Palestinian society with 2 completely different governing authorities between the West Bank and Gaza. So now you have an enclave in Gaza, squalid, blockaded by air, land, and sea by both Israel and Egypt, not occupied. If by occupied it means settlers, boots on the ground, not that, but very, very serious security infrastructure, right, as we learned. But what we thought was an impenetrable fortress, and what Palestinians and their supporters call an open-air prison. If you want to hear that language, I know that language is vexing to you, but I think that if you understand the perspective from the Palestinians, they view, well, we're walled off by air, land, and sea. What do you call that? Like, that's their notion. If we don't have freedom of travel, if we can't visit my cousins in the West Bank, if we can't get in the goods and services we want, though Israel was putting in tons of humanitarian aid every single day for the last 20 years before October 7th, nevertheless, that leads to the politicized language of Gaza is an open-air prison. I simply use the word as blockaded for security reasons. It comes back to that very difficult, contradictory matrix between security and peace, right? How do you come up with a peace plan that also keeps Israel secure? Particularly since we know everything that we need to know just by reading the Hamas charter about what their intentions are or would be had they the ability. They have a genocidal intent against the Jewish state and the Jewish people. That is not covert, that is overt. That's part of how Hamas understands its raison d'etre. Its raison d'etre is to remove the Zionist occupier from all of the land, as we have said many times, from the river to the sea. That is not 2023 language that all of a sudden protesters at Columbia just figured out on their own. Palestinians have been using this language as a political weapon, propaganda, since before the Gaza disengagement. But the idea that Palestine is Palestine from the river to the sea is a very old talking point, Cynthia.
I don't understand, so we were in Egypt a couple years ago. I don't understand what is Egypt's role, and it's very difficult. What is their beef? What's their beef? Like, why?
It's what's their what? Well, with whom?
Like with Gaza, like their brothers.
I'll tell you. Yeah, no. Egypt. No, but that actually is the issue. That is actually the issue. So, first of all, it's complicated because Egypt being an Arab and a Muslim society, one that has long held on to visions of greatness and regional hegemony, wants to be an empire. I mean, if ever there were a country that has a history of empire, look to Egypt. So part of their national identity and pride is still wrapped up in the idea of empire beyond their geographical or political borders. That's part of Egypt's kind of mindset or gestalt, right? And that was Nasser's whole program in the 50s, was real and pan-Arabism, that Egypt would lead the way for all Arab peoples, a very grandiose vision, and that, of course, requires extirpating the Zionist occupier from the land of Israel, what they call Palestine. Specifically, so why would Egypt get into bed with Israel on Gaza? Well, first of all, Egypt is in bed with Israel on security cooperation. That's one of the core agreements of the disengagement from Sinai in '77. So that's part of the deal. It's like we are security partners. But more to the point, Egypt has a real problem with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, there was a quick detour where Egypt actually was run by a strongman from the Muslim Brotherhood right after the Arab Spring, the uprising in Tahrir Square in Cairo. You remember the hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Egypt and throughout the Middle East started in Tunisia, actually. The Arab Spring that quickly, as I like to say, became the Arab Fall. Did not really take over because in most places it was suppressed, sometimes with force of violence and intimidation. Nevertheless, it did send Hosni Mubarak, Israel's strongman military dictator, into exile, where he would eventually die. And he was replaced by a fellow named Mohammed Morsi, who came to political prominence and power through the Muslim Brotherhood. So he was a radicalized Muslim who moderated just enough to become a credible political figure. And by the way, the Obama administration really thought that he could be a strong ally to the West. Turns out that it did not work. I mean, first of all, the Egyptian people were already living in squalor, and Morsi was just corrupt and debased. It was not good. It didn't last long. I think within a year, he was replaced by his successor, Abdel something al-Sisi. Al-Sisi. He's been in power ever since because they don't have democratic elections. So Sisi, by the way, hates the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Egyptians have a problem with Islamic radicalism. I mean, look at how many attacks by Muslim radicals associated with Muslim Brotherhood have taken place on Egyptian soil or downed Egyptian aircraft, like there was a terror attack in Sharm el-Sheikh. Like, we've seen this a few times over the last 30 years. So that's Egypt's vested interest. They don't want Muslim radicalism, Hamas style, spreading into Egypt because that creates a problem in Egypt. Egypt wants to be a model Arab society. It really is it's a fascinating place. I was there in February of 2020 on a rabbi's mission with our spouses or partners and want to go back. We were there 5 minutes before COVID, or as I later learned, we were there during COVID. which is why everyone on our trip, myself included, came back with something funny going on in our respiratory system. Some people were really sick. I felt like I had a cold. Then I read a year later that there was an early outbreak of COVID in Luxor, where we had spent 2 days in close quarters. But I highly recommend a trip to Egypt. And maybe someday... Intense. Yeah, worse or better, depending on how you... Right. Yeah, it's not friendly customer service. No, we traveled with a heavily armed Egyptian security detail, as well as we traveled with ambassadors. We traveled with the foreign minister from Israel to Egypt. It was very cool. It was a very cool mission. I would go back in a heartbeat, just because, you know, it kind of makes Israeli antiquities, no knock on Israeli antiquities. Norm and I geek out to this stuff all the time, but Egyptian antiquities make Israeli antiquities look like Tinker Toys. I mean, the stuff they were building long before the Jews even, like we're good with a hammer and nail, but those Egyptians, man, slavery. Okay, why don't I pick up where we left off? So, and then a big distraction. So while all of this is happening, Israel's still reeling from the Gaza disengagement. Sharon is on a ventilator. Olmert, who, by the way, will quickly be indicted and then convicted on graft and spend time behind bars. So that's not a very long or distinguished prime ministership. Hezbollah on the northern border continued to present itself as a threat. So the Second Lebanon War breaks out in the summer of 2006. Some of you probably remember this. I remember it because I had a bunch of kids from WRT on BBYO or Nifty or Birthright trips that summer, wanting to know what do I do, and working with a lot of anxious parents because they were already over there when the war broke out. On June 25th, 2006, so we're going back a little more than 19 years, Hamas used tunnels, right, just so you understand like how far back this apparatus of warfare goes. Hamas used tunnels that they had dug underneath the Israeli border with Gaza, to kidnap one Gilad Shalit, a corporal on active duty in a tank unit on the Israeli side of the Gaza-Israel border. So Hamas militants, Hamas terrorists came underground, popped up, grabbed Shalit, dragged him back underground into Gaza. 5 IDF soldiers went after them, trying to rescue him, and were killed. Hezbollah in the north, which is in a kind of unholy alliance or a holy alliance with Hamas, because they both support jihad, they both support armed violence against the Zionist occupier, though Hezbollah, like its sponsor in Iran, is a Shiite Muslim organization, and Hamas is Sunni. And in most other cases, Sunnis and Shiites hate each other's guts. But in this case, there's a strategic collaboration and a lot of overlap in their vision of what needs to happen to the Jews. Hezbollah then demanded that Israel release over 1,000 prisoners in exchange for the soldiers. By the way, Israel did not know that the 5 IDF soldiers who tried to rescue Shalit were already dead. Israel refused, and instead the IDF said, we're going to weaken Hezbollah in the north, and so they attacked military targets as well as Lebanese civilian infrastructure, because Hezbollah was largely funded by the completely messed up Lebanese government, including attacks at Beirut's airport. Hezbollah fought back for several intense weeks. The whole war is about 4 weeks in the summer of 06, and they managed to hold the IDF at bay. It was an example, writes Gordis, of the relatively new phenomenon of asymmetrical war. And I put this in bold in my notes so you could really hear what he understands about war that we probably didn't fully understand 20 years ago. Asymmetrical war in which public opinion regarding civilian deaths effectively restricts a stronger democratic power. Right, so part of the issue of this war, there are a lot of asymmetries, right? Israel has a military, its enemies have a militia. Israel is a democracy, these other countries don't have any relationship to democracy, and therefore in Israel, the will of the people still tells the government what they can and cannot do. And Israel unlike these other rogue actors, be they Hamas or Hezbollah, wants to curry favor with the West. As the brilliant author whom I quoted on Rosh Hashanah, Micha Goodman, recently wrote and said on a podcast with Gordis, by the way, in July or August, he said, the paradox of Israel today, again, he's talking summer of 25, before the hostages came home, 3 left bodies in Gaza, 3 candles on the bima now. Goodman said, the paradox of Israel today is that it needs to be feared by its enemies in the region while still being loved by the West. And that everything Israel does in war to be feared by its enemies, which is known as deterrence, right? How do you get your enemies not to do what they are doing? You deter them. One way of doing that is by being so crazy and so brutal that they will be disincentivized to keep making war against you. Everything that Israel does to elicit fear in its enemies are exactly the things that erode its ability to be loved in the West, to be seen as a true democracy, right? So this is also part of the asymmetry of asymmetrical warfare in which, again, public opinion about civilian deaths effectively restricts a stronger democratic power's ability to make war on its enemies. More than 1,000 Lebanese and 165 Israelis were killed in the summer of '06 in the Lebanon War, and Israel caused extensive damage in Lebanon. For approximately a month, you could say the two sides were just bludgeoning each other. With improved use of ground troops, Israel finally began to get the military upper hand, but the United States at the time, under Bush, under W, pressured Israel into accepting a UN-imposed ceasefire, and then the war ended. But since 2006, and this is very important, that war was very, very scarring for the Israeli psyche, and it was very influential on the Israeli military and intelligence services outlook about where are we going in the future. So I've been to Israel many times since '06. I led a WRT trip there as the associate rabbi for adults, and I've probably led 9 or 10 since then. Before October 7th, we would always meet with like some, military top brass, interesting, brilliant, colonel or something, and they would tell us, here's what you need to look at. And all of them were saying for the last 20 years, the next war is coming from the north, right? And so Israel built up, as we have seen in the last 2 years, especially in the last 1 year, a strategy for the next war in the north. Now, we didn't know exactly everything they were up to. All we knew was that it was premised on the idea that, unlike Hamas in Gaza, which had rockets, very, very big difference here. If you're like a military history geek or even just like a tech person, you got to know the difference between a rocket and a missile. You can't use the two words interchangeably. A rocket is a projectile that you fire from the ground. It's a rather inaccurate, crude instrument of war. It goes up, and then it's a parabolic arc, right? It goes up, and then gravity takes over, and it goes down. So depending on the angle you fire it, you hope it will damage some stuff. It's an unguided projectile. A missile is a guided projectile, and the systems of guidance can be very sophisticated, including all the same stuff that works Google Maps, right? And now with pinpoint accuracy. So Israel went deep into its own ballistics technologies, but it was always concerned that Hezbollah, with Iran's sponsorship and help, had a vast arsenal. Somewhere before October 7th, had accumulated somewhere in the order of 150,000 ballistics that it could fire, many of them highly precise and long range. Missiles that fired from southern Lebanon could reach major population centers, certainly in Tel Aviv and maybe even Jerusalem. That was the real worry. Now we've seen things that Israelis were working on, including like, hey, what if we fool Hezbollah into buying these pagers from China? I mean, stuff that has never been tried in warfare before. Totally game-changing for how Israel is going to fight, how everyone is going to fight war in the future, especially the United States, which has all kinds of military agreements with Israel. So when Israel develops new technology in war, and we've seen historically war is the greatest single driver of technological innovation in human civilization, the U.S. benefits. right? We will benefit from their technological advancements. They will benefit from ours. So when I was last in Israel, I've been in Israel since the war, but when I was in Israel in summer of 23, just before October 7th, we toured one of their major ballistics tech firms, and we saw like how they make war today. It's unbelievable. They have like drones that are flying overhead that are making 3D maps of the entire area with all of the buildings rendered in very high definition. And now, since October 7th, it's reliably reported that Israel can, for instance, take overhead drone-generated or drone-captured visual images of like a group of 50 masked Palestinian fighters and figure out which ones are just kids and which ones are bad guys. It's unbelievable. Using visual recognition technologies and all sorts of things that I don't even know the half of. This is a very long and discursive way of getting to my main point, which is that Israel was, from a military and intelligence standpoint, very focused on the north and not very focused on Gaza. It really believed that Gaza could not pull off a major military attack on Israel because it was blockaded so effectively, Israel thought. And that's where these books are really very eye-opening and very disturbing. Yes?
I know this from my teacher. Wasn't the plan, though, my teacher in Jerusalem, the plan was, though, that they would come down, and they were supposed that they just didn't come down. That they were going up.
Who's they?
Hezbollah, they were all going to come down, and like, there's supposed to be a... Yeah,
Oh, yeah. We don't really know. What we know, what has been written, and this is, of course, still ongoing investigation into the massive security and intelligence failures of the IDF, which have not really resulted in serious political consequences for the leaders, as we know. But what we believe Sinwar thought would happen, based on his, kind of back-channel conversations before launching the attack, was that Hezbollah, at a minimum, would join in the fight with Iran's backing, and squeeze Israel into like a pincer, right, which is an old-school military tactic. That did not happen, of course, though. When the war broke out in the north many, many months after October 7th, it did result in the wholesale evacuation of more than 100,000 Israelis from the north, and at that time it was close to 200,000 from the southern communities. So Israel still has a significant number of tens of thousands of Jews who've been displaced from their homes. They've largely returned in the north. Many have not returned because their kibbutzim have not been rebuilt in the south. Michelle. Yeah, I mean, look, the rhetoric, if not the strategy, has always been crystal clear. The intentions of Hezbollah are not mysterious to Israel, never have been. Again, which is why Israel invested so much effort, and what we did not know was how effective they would be not just against Hezbollah, but against the Islamic regime in Iran. Which was absolutely astonishing, that in the space of 12 days this past June of 2025, they were able to take out all of Iran's central military command, its top nuclear scientists, and sufficiently degrade its what do you call a place where you refine uranium? Nuclear refine? Is it a refinery? Yeah. And I think the best analysis, by the way, we're not there, we'll get to it next week. People want to know what I think about Trump in that. I'm very glad that the United States joined that fight. I think it was much more not a deep, long strategy. I think Trump saw which way things were going and wanted to ride the tiger. That's not my own analysis. I think it's a cogent one, though. Okay. So meanwhile, and I'm going back and forth between Hezbollah and Hamas. Hamas had won the Palestinian election, but the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, still governs, refuse to relinquish power. So what happens in Gaza in June of 2007 is that Hamas militants decide to stage a violent coup, and they just violently seize control of the Gaza Strip, very similar to what we saw right after the ceasefire just last month, right? Hamas immediately took whatever armaments it could get, armed up its, balaclava-wearing militants, and started executing publicly in the streets anyone whom they believed was a dissenter, so that they could recapture something like an iron grip on the power structures of Gaza. Militants staged a violent coup. They blew up the Fatah headquarters in Khan Yunis, which is a city in the Gaza Strip toward the south. Not far. If you look at the Gaza Strip, it's like this little, I'll do it backwards, it's this little chunk of land about the size of Detroit or Philly. Up here in the north is, and it's on an angle, so there's the Mediterranean, here's Gaza. Up here is Gaza City, kind of middle south is Khan Yunis, and then we know the city closest to the Egyptian border is Rafah. And so if you've been paying attention to the war over the last 2 years, you've heard Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and the terrible humanitarian crises of displacement from homes from one place to the next, picking up what meager belongings you have, trying to scrape out a living with food. It's pretty awful. We've seen these images. You can go back on YouTube. Fatah personnel were thrown off of buildings by Hamas, like violent intimidation, terror of the population of Gaza to bring the population to heel and submit to the will of Hamas and get Fatah out. Amid the various tributes and writings that I've been reading offered upon the death of Dick Cheney, by the way, I was reminded in one that it was in fact Condoleezza Rice in the second administration of W that pushed for Hamas to be included in those elections in the first place, against what Israel wanted. Israel said, these are bad guys, we can't really work with them, they're not going to govern, they're jihadist. It was Condi, and a hawk, by the way. But I think that the Bush administration at that time, if I'm not mistaken, was planning the surge in Iraq and also dealing with ISIS militants, and did not want more problems on its hands. And so it said, no, you should include Hamas. I don't really know the reasoning. It was just sort of like a little end note in something I was reading. Upon their election, Hamas officials go public and they declare, once again, that they would neither recognize Israel nor negotiate with it. And Olmert resigned in March 2009 amid allegations of corruption and, in fact, was convicted and served time. And Hamas, as it were, has been governing in Gaza ever since with no elections, while the Palestinian Authority remains in the West Bank, also with no elections. Every year or two since, Hamas, so now it's 2008, 2009. How do we get from 2009 to 2015, where I'm going to end today's class just doing this in decade increments? Every year or two in this period, Hamas would fire hundreds or even thousands of rockets at Israeli cities. Again, crude instruments, unguided projectiles, but they'd be firing into places like Sderot. These are not long-range ballistics. They're short-range, but they would land in a field. And you've seen, perhaps if you've been to Israel any time in the last 15 years, you've seen like there's an artist who lives in the Negev, and he takes recovered like mortars and shells and from projectiles, and like he turns them into Judaica. It's actually kind of cool. You can like wear a little necklace that's been from the metal of a Katyusha rocket, which is a kind of a crude old Soviet instrument. Or he makes a menorah out of like stuff. It's kind of like, hey, you didn't kill us, and we're gonna. There was also an image even from the last 2 years of the Gaza war of an IDF battalion celebrating Hanukkah in Gaza with a makeshift menorah that they had made out of a scrapped projectile, right? It's kind of cool. And these rocket attacks would disrupt what seemed to be kind of like a norm of normalcy and quiet. So I think Israelis were kind of lulled into a sense of, this is just the new status quo. This is how it's going to go. Every couple of years or so, Hamas is going to start barraging our towns and cities along the border with rockets, full well knowing what's going to happen next. And what's going to happen next? Israel's going to respond with force that it has the capabilities of dispensing in ways that Hamas does not. More Palestinians will die, including civilians, than Israelis, even if a few Israelis die. The narrative that we are then able to push out to the world is indiscriminate. This is, again, the asymmetric war tactic that was kind of new in the Second Lebanon War, but then Hamas looked and said, oh, that's a good tactic because it generates sympathy in the democratic West on body count alone. Starting in 2009, I began teaching about the ethics of war. And some of what I teach is derived from a wonderful lecture and a companion article by Daniel Hartman, Orthodox rabbi and head of the Shalom Hartman Institute. His late father, David Hartman of blessed memory from Montreal, spoke at WRT many times. We honored the late Rabbi Jacob Rubinstein of Young Israel of Scarsdale with a memorial lecture for a number of years after his death, tragic death in a house fire around Pesach time. Hartman, his son, Daniel, wrote an article about the ethics of war, and he says that the body count is immaterial because no sovereign nation should have to live with its people in terror of going to bed at night. Like, that's not an acceptable condition for any nation, right? You should not go to bed at night thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to die tonight from a rocket from my enemy. That is not an okay thing for a democracy, and therefore the morality of war is not about how do we kill as many people on their side as they have killed on ours? That's kind of a meaningless construct, but rather, how much are we willing to fight? What is the cost that the enemy must bear in order for us to achieve an identified military objective, right? So if you look at the war of the last 2 years, there were 2 identified objectives. Well, 3, which was not spoken publicly, which was the most important. But the 2 publicly shared military objectives were, as you know, return our hostages and decapitate Hamas, or remove Hamas from power. Well, we can argue about the success of this, but those were the objectives. But the third, less spoken one, was the most important. We need to, and right fast, restore the Israeli public's trust in the IDF and in the government. Right? That was actually number 1, because it is also an unacceptable condition for any country to think that its military has and will continue to fail them. Right? That is not okay. We would not accept that condition here in the States. Right? That's why, even though we went to the wrong country, okay, that was an editorial. Even though we went to Afghanistan, where there was very little evidence that anyone related to 9/11 was actually, at the time, working or operating, they were all Saudis, all 19 hijackers. Nevertheless, it was very important to the American people and to the project of the American democracy that we went to war after 9/11. It's like, well, who are we going to fight? Al-Qaeda. Where are we going to find them? Afghanistan, because they train over there. Okay. Ruth. Correct. Correct. Iron Dome, David Sling, 2 anti-ballistic technologies that were developed and changed the game. I remember as a kid, late night TV, laughing at Ronald Reagan's Star Wars proposal, right? It was widely derided as, I mean, the name even said it, this is sci-fi, not sci-real. But as it turns out, Israeli took a very sci-fi concept, and if you haven't seen House of Dynamite on Netflix, don't watch it if you like to sleep. Yeah, don't watch it, or do. Yeah, I mean, like, if you have blood pressure issues, don't watch it. But it does contemplate an unidentified, like in terms of source, nuclear-armed ballistic heading straight for a major city in the United States. That's the scenario of House of Dynamite. It's by Catherine Bigelow, who did Hurt Locker and 30 30 Dark, 30 Rock, I don't know. 30 Dark Zero, some title that makes no sense unless you're like into it. Anyway, this film does have, like, it's divided into 3 acts, and one of them is called Trying to Hit a Bullet with a Bullet, right? That was the idea. That shooting down a ballistic midair that's traveling at 1,000 miles an hour with a missile defense technology, it is the stuff of sci-fi, but again, that's the IDF for you. And it really did change the nature of the game. Originally, that was why David's sling was invented. So Iron Dome was originally just for unguided projectiles, rockets. But it's been all adapted. I'm not sure I know of or can get the connection there. I don't know. I don't know enough. That's pretty deep down a rabbit hole of why Hamas why Hamas had cruder technology than Hezbollah. But it would be a good rabbit hole to go down. Okay. Now, invariably, and by the way, you may ask, well, why did the IDF have to respond every single time? Why did the IDF just choose, why couldn't they just choose not to retaliate? I mean, and sometimes they did. There was a whole lot of hand-wringing about how much the response should be restrained every time Hamas would fire rockets into civilian population areas in Israel, even if the number of casualties was small or none. And the answer is because Israelis expect their government to protect them. A lot of this comes down to, like, how do you run a country? And if you want to succeed, and especially in a democracy, if your people can vote you out in the next election, you don't want your opponents in the Knesset to say, and this is the prime minister whose administration, when we were being, when we were hiding in shelters in Sderot, this is the prime minister who said we will do nothing. That's very bad politics. So just so you understand, like, what we do militarily and what Israel does politically, they're entangled. There's no way to separate the two. So Israel's the typical way this would go is as follows, and then I made a list of all of the conflicts. So I just want to tell you, it's more important that you get the trends. Like, when you're learning history, any history teacher who tells you that it's about remembering dates and names and battlefields, no, not really. You should understand why countries and civilizations do the things they do. So typically, after a rocket strike in Israel from Gaza, Israel's Air Force would punish Hamas from the skies. And in 2 of the conflicts between 2009 and 2015, they entered with ground forces. And vicious battles would ensue. Hamas would try to hinder the IDF's progress on land and would seek to exact as high a price as possible in Israeli casualties, but also in Palestinian casualties. In other words, the idea of jerry-rigging a battlefield in order to maximize casualties of your own civilian was also a tactic developed by Hamas over this 20-year period that, of course, came into full bloom during the war since October 7th, that no other enemy and no other combatant has ever tried this before. Like, even the Nazis did not want Nazis to get killed in war, right? The Nazis would not have considered it a long-run victory for more Germans to die in World War II and to use that against the Allies, right? That was never part of it. And by the way, another difference, even the Nazis tried to cover up their atrocities. Hamas on October 7th broadcast them, right? So you want to talk, like, this is the kind of enemy that Israel, on much too little notice, they could have been doing their homework, they didn't, was dealing with on October 7th. We'll get to that next week. After a time, a ceasefire would be declared, and you'd ride it out till the next round. And that's how this went. Gordis puts it this way. Hamas and Israel would time and again bloody each other but achieve no substantive strategic gain. Hamas, like Hezbollah, failed to get Israel to capitulate, withdraw, change any major policy, and Israel, for its part, was totally unable to destroy the terror networks, the infrastructure of war, or assure itself that its enemy would not attack again. So it has been just this bloodying each other's noses, or worse, for year and year and year, and accepting that that's going to be the status quo. That's what it is to live in Israel, they would say. Michelle. Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, no permanent resolution to the no attempts at resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were really undertaken during this period. Most of the time, for all of this period, Netanyahu is in power in a right-leaning government that had no interest in Palestinian statehood whatsoever. And so that wasn't the game. Literally, it was just a game of inches on one side, inches on the other side, with no real strategic advantage conferred upon one party or the other. Okay, here's a quick rundown of all the military engagements between Israel and Hamas between 2007 and 2015. Again, what I want you to take away is they are mostly alike. They are much more the same than different, though I'll give a little shading. 2008, clashes between Hamas and Israel. Egypt brokered a truce in June of 2008 that reduced Hamas rocket fire by about 98%, so a trickle coming over. And they even eased the blockade a little bit to say to Hamas, hey, if you just chill and stop firing into Sderot and the southern communities, we'll make it easier to get supplies across our border. Our border meaning with Sinai. This was broken in November. So Israel broke the truce a few months after, like 5 months after the ceasefire that Egypt negotiated, in order to raid a Hamas tunnel. So Israel was using technology to detect tunnels using sonar and other high-tech operations to figure out where had Hamas placed all of these tunnels. And at the time, tunnels were a concern of Israel only insofar as they were extending underneath the border fence, the wall, and could provide access for militants to come underneath like they did with Shalit. And Shalit was still in Gaza, by the way. Right? Shalit was captive for 5 years. So now it's 2008. That's only 2 years into his captivity. So Israel was very concerned and made concerted efforts to degrade the tunnel infrastructure. And I've seen these tunnels. And they're not like little crawl spaces. You can walk upright through an illuminated passage with there's water and there are desks and there's internet. It's a whole thing. Billions and billions, I sound like Carl Sagan, billions of dollars expended on this. Okay. Then we have something that is at first called Operation Cast Lead. This is winter 08-09. Starts in December 08, goes into January 09. You may recall this. It was also later named the First Gaza War. Israel launched airstrikes and a ground invasion targeting Hamas rocket installations and infrastructure. It lasted 3 weeks. 1,400 Palestinians, mostly civilians, were killed. 13 Israelis, mostly soldiers. It ended with unilateral ceasefires and widespread destruction in Gaza. March 2011, Palestinian militants made it across the border and killed Israeli passengers on a bus near Gaza. Israel responded with airstrikes, killed 15 militants in clashes. November 2012, now called the Second Gaza War, Operation Pillar of Defense. Israel assassinated a Hamas military chief named Ahmed Jabari via an airstrike and then struck rocket installations. The conflict lasted 8 days. 167 Palestinians were killed, 102 of them civilians. 6 Israelis were killed. It ends in an Egyptian brokered ceasefire. June of 2014, July of 2014, Hamas militants kidnapped 3 Israeli teenagers. Do you remember this? Yeah. One was from this part of the world. One was from New Rochelle, if I'm not mistaken. Again, they are Orthodox Jews, very right-wing, pro-settler. At least one was an American youth whose family had made Aliyah. They were kidnapped. Israel arrested hundreds in the West Bank, and when it went on its security raid in the West Bank, Hamas launched rockets from Gaza. So Hamas, even though politically it has no love for Fatah, the political or the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, that whole messed up infrastructure of Palestinian governance in the West Bank, they still see themselves as one people. And so they will say, yes, see what Israel's doing, now's our moment, jihad, right? We're gonna continue to wage what they believe is a religious holy war, even though West Bank Palestinians are largely not oriented toward Islamic radicalism in the same way. Though, over the last 2 years, the population has understandably become more radicalized. So, if Hamas were to run in an election in the West Bank today, all Palestinian authorities and pollsters, these are like academics. Like, these are people who are credible pollsters say Hamas would win in a landslide. That's a part of the big problem, right? Their stock has actually gone up even though they've been badly militarily degraded. So there is an entirely possible outcome, I would say even likely, where we just continue to play whack-a-mole. Because as has been pointed out, Hamas is more than just a military infrastructure. It is an idea. It's an ideology. Now, it is also, however, was a highly organized militia. And that's why I think the people who say, well, for every Hamas fighter that you kill, because it's an ideology, somebody else gets radicalized and then they join the ranks. Okay, but on October 6th, Hamas had 30,000 highly trained troops organized into regiments for combat by air, land, sea, and cyber war. Okay, and continues to aspire to the same today. We'll see what happens. I heard a fascinating podcast this past week on Dan Sinor with Yonatan Adiri. Fascinating insights, basically saying, well, Hamas is, as an organization and as an ideology, it maintains the same worldview, vision, and talking points. But as an organization, it has morphed and shifted its approach at least 3 times already. It begins as kind of like this Muslim Brotherhood, militia / social services organization, because if you are a destitute Palestinian who still thinks, even after 5 generations, that you are, like every family member before you, a refugee, because UNRWA lets you be a refugee. I have a lot to say about that next week. Nevertheless, if that's your worldview, right, and you say, well, who's going to take care of me? It was Hamas in the 80s that was actually putting food on the table, water in the pipes, electricity in your homes, and opportunities to work or get an education for your kids. And of course, it came with all the Islamo-fascist garbage in the education, right? And the TV shows which Hamas controls, the media, they have like a version of Mickey Mouse, where little Mickey and Minnie cartoons get to strap on AK-47s and teach little boys and girls in Gaza about the ultimate goal for your life is jihad, and if you die, hooray. Like that's taught, and it infects the entire system over there. But that was what Hamas was up to, right? Even before it started building tunnels. Then we see how Hamas operates into kind of like this antagonistic actor with its rockets and whatnot. Then they organize, they build tunnels, they have an entire war-making apparatus, and then that leads to October 7th. The fascinating conjecture that Adiri offers in this podcast, and again, just go to Dan Sinor's podcast and look up the episode from a few days ago with Yonatan Adiri. He basically says what we now have to be thinking about is Hamas turning into a legitimate organization with diplomatic authority, with diplomatic approval, that it can actually play in the big leagues on the world stage, and that it will, maybe it will mitigate its armed conflict, but the real worry is that now it is fighting for hearts and minds in the West, and on that measure, succeeding. And that is what Israel is unprepared for, that reality of Hamas, what he calls Hamas 4.0. More on that next week. Okay, so finally, a third war in Gaza, summer of 2014, called Operation Protective Edge. Israel conducted airstrikes, artillery and ground invasion in response to more than 4,500 rockets being fired into Israel's south. The war lasts 50 days, 2,251 Palestinians, 65% of them civilians, which, by the way, in modern urban combat, again, I hate this, right? I hate even saying it. It's good. Okay, why is it good? Well, the ratios of civilian dead to combatants in previous urban conflicts, whether they were in Fallujah, in the Iraq War in 2004, 2005, I think, or in much earlier urban conflicts in like places like Hanoi or in Dresden, right? The civilian death toll relative to identified combatants is just vast and horrific. But of course, we would not tolerate Dresden today any more than we would tolerate another Hiroshima. Please God, I hope that's the case. And that's one of the things that the Geneva Convention provides, is that we're not going to make war like that anymore. Nevertheless, if you say in a conflict, two civilians die for every one combatant, that's about 65%. That is good. And Israel would argue that we're doing even better in the war since October 7th, in that Israel says somewhere on the order of 2, maybe less than 2 civilians died for every one armed and dangerous combatant. As my friend Uri Feinberg, whose daughters have fought in this war, he has 3 daughters, 2 of whom fought in Iron Dome units during the war, one of whom is just started this month in a border infantry unit on the Egyptian, the Sinai border. Uri, who leads trips to Israel, many of you have met Uri, he's spoken here many times. He's a Reformed Jew, grew up in the States, made Aliyah as a kid. Anyway, Uri has said, well, yeah, but there's a lot of gray in these conflicts. What do you call a 15-year-old Palestinian boy with heavy artillery? Is that a combatant or is that a civilian? I mean, on the one hand, it's a boy, right? I mean, I've got 10 or 11 15-year-old boys and another 10 or 11 15-year-old girls coming back from Eisner camp any minute now where they've spent the weekend. I kind of think of them as kids, don't you? But put a gun in their hand and tell them that their holiest purpose in life is to kill Jews, and how do you treat them? I mean, I'm not going to answer that for you, but I think that certainly when the Gaza Health Ministry, aka Hamas, tells you, well, 67,000 people have been killed. Okay. Israel would say, well, hang on a second, at least 18,000 of those were highly armed and dangerous combatants. Again, about 2 to 1. What do you do with that? I don't know. Michelle? Yeah, exactly. I mean, the PA, for its part, to say nothing of Hamas, has long had a notorious pay-to-slay program. I'm sure they don't call it that, by the way. They probably call it a martyrs fund. But it is well known that there are substantial financial incentives. Even as recently as last month, the PA had announced that it had millions of shekels set aside. I knew it was shekels, right, in the West Bank. They have millions of shekels set aside in dedicated bank accounts for Palestinian prisoners who are being released from jails. Surely some of those people who were behind bars languishing in Israeli jails should not have been there. And many of them should have been. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so what's the effect in our remaining time here? I don't want to just talk about the military effect. I want to spend just a few moments inviting us to consider the psychic effect. Because one of the hardest psychic impacts of all of this skirmishing between 2005 and 2015, which is the decade we're covering today, was that Israelis began to lick their wounds a bit, realizing they had not really won a war since 1973. That's a long time to feel like you haven't won. I'm listening to an incredible podcast on the Civil War right now. I'm retaking the class I took at Amherst my senior year. My professor, David Blight, and I mentioned this on Rosh Hashanah, on Kol Nidre, they recorded his lectures at Yale, so you can go to College Commons, just look up David Blight. He won the Pulitzer for his bio of Frederick Douglass in 2018 or 2019, which is a magnificent bio. And a doorstop, 900 pages. But Blight is giving this series of lectures, and he talked about the psyche of the South after the Civil War, and that even to the present day, the South has had a whole mentality of the lost cause, right? Losing war changes you as a society. He actually goes on in his lecture to say that the loss of the United States, or the way it's been processed long after the war in Vietnam, ameliorated some Southern grievances. Because now we're not the only losers, right? But nobody wants to be a loser. And in these conflicts, as casualties mounted, Israelis would take note of an additional change in their society. So in the 60s, it had been the kibbutzim that produced the officers of the IDF. Like the labor Zionists were also deeply invested in the leadership structures of the wars. And also, it was they who suffered casualties disproportionate to the general population in Israeli life. But starting in the 2000s, it became the national religious community that had taken on the role of really being on the front lines of war. And so you see a kind of growing sense of identification between the religious Zionist movements in Israel and their political parties and leaders, and a more bellicose, hawkish, and war-friendly orientation. Right? Does that make sense? So that if you wonder today, why are all of these religious Jews so invested in the debate that roiled Israel for the last half a year or more, 2 years really, but especially in the last 2 years, is why go back into Gaza? Stop making war. But Netanyahu knew he could do that because he had a majority of Israelis, at least enough Israelis supporting that, even at the expense of living hostages. You have a lot of people saying, even if the hostages are killed. And that reflects this kind of strange growing alliance between Jews who are highly nationalistic, extremely Jewish religious extremists, and who believe that we must destroy Hamas above all else. And that if you had to choose between those two strategic objectives, bring home the hostages, vanquish Hamas once and for all, they were very much in favor of the latter. A lot of people in our communities didn't get that because that's not, my Israeli Reform rabbi friends were very supportive of Israel going to war, but they were less supportive of continuing a war if it meant that hostages would never come home. Okay, finishing here. So a couple of other things that are happening. This is really also, ironically, Israel is not languishing. While it's doing, I've been focusing on the conflict, but this is also the tech boom in Israel. This is Startup Nation. The GDP grew in Israel between 2009 and 2015 by more than 3% annually. Israel joined a world network called OECD of high-tech, innovative countries. R&D spending surged 4.2%. By 2015, startups were everywhere. And then the cost of living got so high that you have a mass protest movement. You say, oh, wait, I've heard about mass protest movements in Israel. Well, there's a long tradition of them, but there's one within recent memory that a lot of people have forgotten since the judicial reforms and the war, which is that hundreds of thousands of Israelis started taking to the streets in 2011 to protest high living costs, housing shortages, inequality. And this led to some government reform in food, housing subsidies, and competition policies. And finally, during this period, you also have a shift in tensions between this high-tech society that now is starting to be seen as a major player in world markets and on the global stage, and the ultra-Orthodox, who contribute nothing to the material wealth of the country and who won't serve in the army. And so that's been a long simmering tension, but as Israel is becoming like this boomtown nation, and as it is increasingly apparent that there's no end in sight to the need for a strong military, both in the north and in the south, it is increasingly vexing to secular Israelis that the Haredi live on welfare and effectively live on the welfare of the state, drain resources, believe that they are protecting Jews by studying Torah. I try that all the time. No, I'm a pacifist. I will study Torah and keep us all spiritually safe. I will pray. And as a result, it is an incredible sore spot in Israeli society that they won't put on uniform and go into the IDF. It continues to roil national politics today. I'd say it's the biggest internal issue for Netanyahu's coalition. It's the one thing that most analysts believe could actually bring down the government, is forcing the Haredi to serve against their will, like forcing them, dragging them into service. His right-wing ministers will pull out of the government, collapse the government, and call for new elections. And that's what Netanyahu's up against now. He's not so worried about kids in encampments on Columbia campus, I promise you. He does not stay up at night worrying about those things. What Netanyahu stays up at night worrying about is, am I going to have a coalition tomorrow, and how much do I have to give them to ensure that I will? So, to be continued next time, I want to add that if you are around on Sunday, December 14th, same bat time, same bat channel, here at noon, I'd like to propose a kind of open dialogue session where we could just do Q&A. And I might even bring in a few people whose expertise in these matters exceeds my own by a whole heck of a lot. I'm mostly just like a person who likes to read and listen a lot. So I teach out of my love of learning, but I would love to just do an open dialogue. I'm not able to do it. We're not holding class the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend. So next week we meet for session number 4. Then we're off for Thanksgiving. The 7th, I have an overriding commitment. But we could come back before, like at the end of Hanukkah. It's the last day of Hanukkah, and have kind of like just an open Q&A. Let's talk about this. Where are we now? Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next week.